I've gone on an extended campaign to try and challenge this concept of neutrality. Let's make clear what I don't mean by that. I've tried to make clear what I mean by saying that I believe neutrality is an illusion. By that, do I mean that everything is subjective, that there are no facts in the world that matter, that there's no reason to, investigate the world, that you can just make up anything because nobody's neutral anyway? Is that what I mean? No. The facts of the world matter. Understanding the context in which we might make sense of those facts matter. Exposing yourself to a wide range of opinion matters so that you can test out your own ideas. To claim that neutrality is an illusion is not to claim that the world is an illusion or that every claim is equally valid. To claim that there is no neutral ground on which to stand doesn't mean you can make up anything you want, spew it, and expect people to believe it. Okay? It means that we're trying to understand the place from which we speak, the place from which we view the world. And how to do that is the question I want to take up for the rest of the day. And I want to do it by looking at the concept of ideology. So we're going to try and start thinking about how we do understand the world by thinking about the concept of ideology. I have argued that thinking that one can be neutral and observe the world from some position of neutrality is an illusion, but then how do we start to think about how we do understand the world? And I think the term ideology is helpful in doing that. Now, you'll find that in journalism, the notion of examining ideology is going to be very tricky. Most mainstream journalists will reject this as well. This is a quote from Len Downie, who's an important journalist in the United States over the last few decades. Recently retired from the position of executive editor of the Washington Post, one of the probably 3 most important newspapers in the United States. Len Downing was at the top of professional journalism. Okay? This is not some guy on some small paper out in the middle of nowhere. This is someone whose opinions matter, and I think someone whose opinion tends to reflect a common point of view in American mainstream journalism. Len Downing says, in our news gathering at the Washington Post, we seek to be strictly nonpartisan and non-ideological. Nonpartisan and non-ideological. Okay. So I want to think through that claim for a minute. He's suggesting that journalists can be nonpartisan. By that, I take it he means that journalists can report on the world without taking sides overtly between political parties. Nonpartisan tends to mean one has not affiliated with a political party. That part of the claim Len Downie makes, I believe, is in fact accurate. That contemporary mainstream journalism is nonpartisan. The Washington Post is not a Democratic Party paper, nor is it a Republican Party paper, or a Libertarian Party or Green Party or any other party you can imagine. In my experience of reading these publications, thinking about them, reading research about them, I think the claim that contemporary mainstream American journalism is for the most part nonpartisan is an accurate claim. There may be newspapers who on their editorial page, the place where they state their opinions, might consistently endorse the policies or politicians of one party over another. That's true. If you look at the New York Times, for instance, it's consistently in its editorial positions leans toward the Democratic Party. It tends to endorse Democratic Party politicians and, in general, the policies that the Democratic Party supports. So the New York Times is a Democratic Party paper in its editorial page, in that one page of the newspaper where it puts forward its own opinion. But if you look at the entirety of the New York Times in its news reporting, I would argue it's nonpartisan. It doesn't reflect a particular party. Okay? So you may disagree with that, but accept that for purposes of our discussion today. Okay? So Len Downing is saying we're nonpartisan and non-ideological. I'm willing to accept the nonpartisan part based on the evidence that I see. What I want to ask today is, what does it mean to claim one is non-ideological? And I'm going to suggest it means essentially the same thing as claiming one is neutral. That one can stand outside of the world and report on the world in some sense. Now, to make sense of that position, we have to talk about what ideology means. Excuse me. So what I want to do for the remainder of the period is talk about what we mean by this term ideology. Okay? It's an important concept in trying to sort through these kinds of questions. All right. Now, one more quote from a journalist before we move forward to that. Jonathan Klein, former president of CNN. Okay? Again, mainstream journalism. Klein, as the chief sort of journalist at a major cable news network, gets a lot of complaints, which shouldn't surprise you. And Klein says, I hear from both the left and the right, and the tone of the criticism is quite similar and not substantial. I get the same sort of questions from extremists on both sides, and I can't get engaged in that conversation. I'm not here to please the fringes. What Klein is articulating here again is a very common position taken by journalism in the mainstream, that there are critics of American journalism. And those critics come from both the left and the right. And those critics sound the same to journalists, and therefore are equally useful, or in this case, as he's arguing, not very useful. That when there is a claim that somehow journalism is actually not neutral, that it displays an ideology, that there is a perspective in the way that reporters go forward, when that critique is offered to journalists, this is the most common response, which is summed up: the right hates us, the left hates us, we must be doing something right. Correct? You've heard this. Listen, if people on the right hate you and people on the left hate you, you must be doing your job, correct? Because if everybody hates you, then you're a good person. Huh? I've been using that one in a personal vein for a long time. I say, listen, everybody hates me, I must be the greatest person in the world. Because nobody likes me. That's why I don't have any friends. I don't have any friends because I am so magnificent. You see the logic in that. Okay, so it's a little odd way to argue, but it's a common argument that journalists make. The right hates us, the left hates us, and they hate us because we are neutral. They hate us because we are not ideological, and they are. That's really what Klein is arguing. And again, Klein's argument here is not idiosyncratic. You'll hear journalists say this over and over again. I have no doubt that during my career in journalism a long time ago, I probably said it. It's a defense mechanism. It's a way that journalism prevents itself from reflecting on those questions about politics, about ideology. Now, I wanted to put that up as a lead-in to the first of three ways we're going to talk about the concept of ideology. Okay? We're going to look at the term ideology, and we're going to recognize that, like many terms, it can be used by different people in different ways. It doesn't take long to observe that people will use the same term often to mean very different things. That's sometimes the cause of arguments, right? Because people are using the same term in different ways. I'm going to outline what I think are the three common ways the term ideology is used. This will be my summary of a lot of writing and thinking about ideology, the way I find it easiest to sum up the concept of ideology. And I'm going to suggest that there are three ways that it's used or can be used in the culture. The first is what I'm calling ideology as it's used in everyday language. This is the sense of ideology that I think Jonathan Klein was talking about. From this point of view, the way we use ideology often in everyday language, an ideology is a belief system that is abstract, rigid, impractical, or fanatical. When people are using ideology in this sense, they're essentially using the term ideology as an insult. How many of you want to have a belief system that's abstract, rigid, impractical, or fanatical? Those don't sound very positive attributes for the way you look at the world. So when people use ideology in this fashion, that's what they're essentially doing. They're saying, listen, you've got a problem. Right? When Jonathan Klein is saying the right and the left are ideological, what he means is the right and the left are both caught up in some system that's too abstract, rigid, impractical, fanatical. This is the term that through most of my life, for instance, my father has used the term ideology, directed at me. Your problem, Bob, he would say, is you're ideological. What did that mean? He meant that my belief system had some problems. So, from this point of view, if this is what you believe ideology is, if this is the way you use the term ideology, right? Ideology is what other folks have, and it's something that keeps them from seeing the world clearly. So when my father would say to me that I'm too ideological, what he meant is, you should see the world the way I do because I see it clearly and you don't, and this ideology you have is an impediment to you seeing the world clearly. So when people say you're too ideological, what they mean typically is that you're ideological and they're not. If I say to you, son, you're a good boy, but you're just too ideological, the implication is that I have escaped that. I'm not trapped by ideology, but you are. Okay? Right? Now there's an assumption behind that. And the assumption is that there is sort of a common sense way you can look at the world without resorting to ideology, and you can see things pretty clearly. And that ideology is a distorting factor. So the way that we use the term ideological in everyday language, right, tends to be to use it as an insult to suggest that the person you're speaking to has a distorted view of the world because of his or her ideology. And that you have somehow escaped the trap of ideology. And that it's possible to escape the trap of ideology by applying a kind of common sense to the way the world works. So there's always this assumption when somebody's saying you're ideological that if you would just get your act together and be more like me, yes? And we can understand that. Maybe it's a human instinct to believe that you understand the world. After all, if you've thought about the world, you've worked hard to try and understand the world, you probably think you're right. Right? And you want other people to benefit from the depth of your own brilliance. So you want them to adopt your point of view. And the only thing that keeps them from adopting your point of view must be that they've got this crazy ideology. Otherwise, they would see the world as you see it, which is to say, the correct way. Okay? That's what I'm going to call the everyday use of the word ideological. It's the way I think that journalists often use the term ideological when they are trying to repel critique. So if you are a journalist and you've produced a story and you get criticism of that story that challenges the basic framework within which you're reporting, one way to repel that is simply to say, well, that critique is ideological, implying that somehow you have transcended ideology. And the question is that a good position to take? Can you defend that position?